Jiaoran, clouds above the creek. Stretching and coiling, what do you end up with? Twinning above the stream or surrounding the skies. You have form, but are not a thing of substance. Leaving no trace, you go off following the wind. Don't blame me for always chasing after you. Floating about, you're no different than I. Okay, so this is a poem by Jiaoran, and with it we continue the trend of highlighting poets by Buddhist monks. Now, Jiaoran was actually included in the 300 Tang poems anthology with one piece about one of his visits to a friend who was living in the mountains in the outskirts of a city. I decided to include one or two more poems of him in this expansion of the anthology because, well, I'm a little bit at loggerheads about his importance, but I think he must be important, from a subjective point of view. I have two books that are partially by him in my bookshelves, which is much more than I can say for almost any Tang poet except the big ones like Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, and so on. Allegedly, the books are very peculiar. One of them is an academic study, which is not very big. It's about 80 pages or so, which includes 30 of his poems and a biography. And the other one is a selection made by a Japanese monk of some of Jiaoran's reflections on literary criticism. But anyway, I think, well, for these and for other reasons that I'll mention shortly, I think he probably should be more represented in the anthology. So if you don't remember from the previous video, very brief overview of Jiaoran. Jiaoran was, as said, a Buddhist monk. His original name was Xie before taking Buddhist orders. He was allegedly a 10th generation descendant of the great Six Dynasties poet Xie Lingyun. And then he takes many things from Xie Lingyun, I think, including his love for landscape poetry. So Jiaoran mostly lived in the middle second half of the 8th century. So he flourished basically after the An Lushan rebellion. And he mostly lived in the area of the lower course of the Jiangzi Valley. And there he formed a kind of a coterie with other artists and intellectuals, people like the famous calligrapher Yang Chengqing or Lu Yu, the author of the Chajing, the classic of tea. So generally in the last decades of the 8th century, he acted, as a sort of, if not a patron, at least a focus for different writers, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist. He had a peculiar style of poetry, which is one of these early examples in which you see this attempt at merging a Buddhist sensitivity with more conventional, traditional, scholarly official poetry. But this is more noticeable in his criticism. Now, he was very popular in his day, or relatively popular, for his poetry, but I think he was really even more famous for his literary criticism, of which at least 3 works have survived. And the gist of this criticism is like today it feels so typical of traditional Chinese poetry that its possible originality in its moment will be overlooked. But the main ideas in his criticism are that the best sort of poetry is like the high Tang poetry. That is to say, a poetry that basically describes natural scenes, and these apparently objective descriptions of nature and the landscape are meant to be read as an indirect statement and reflection of the poet's feelings. That is, the mirror of nature is meant to be one of the main ways of writing, of thematically structuring, and of giving content to a poem for him. Like he would frown a little bit in his literary criticism on works that were just too pedantic, too scholarly official, like poems with lots of obscure allusions, fancy wordplay, this sort of stuff. Like that's not the poetry he appreciates the most. And we could probably say that he's the great the first great theoretician of the high town style of nature poetry, of landscape poetry, that will become, really canonical in all the classical Chinese poetry tradition, to the point that that is what you think of when you think of a classical Chinese poem, something like that, where you get an apparent description of nature, which is coded in a non-immediate way with the feelings of the poetic persona. Okay, I think that's enough background. The poem that we've read today, Clouds Above the Creek, is part of a series of 5 Nanqi Zayong miscellaneous songs from Southern Creek. And it pretty much fits this pattern. As you saw, the topic of it is the poet describing or dialoguing with nature, more specifically with a cloud, or with a group of clouds. This is not an innovative subject. We encountered this, I think we encountered it in the anthology before. So clouds are traditionally associated with hermits. Like, they are found in the mountains, they wander around from place to place, and they're typically used as this sort of stand-in, as this sort of metaphor for the Buddhist monk poet or the Taoist hermit himself. The poem is pretty straightforward. Like the topic is, I would say, this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see that it has 6 lines, which is unusual. So it's not a regulated poem, but it's pentasyllabic, and probably an old-style poem. Then, yeah, I suspect. Jiaoran was famous for writing in different styles. His regulated verse is known and was this sort of conventional pieces, but he also has literature or poems in other styles. So, as we said, the topic of this poem is pretty straightforward. He is dialoguing with this cloud, but the cloud is a reflection, is a dark brother, a syzygy, well, not dark, just an alter ego of the poet himself. So, while talking about the cloud, he is talking about himself. Let's look at the poem as usual, couplet by couplet. 1, 2, 3 couplets, yeah. Stretching and coiling, what do you end up with? Twinning above the stream or surrounding the skies. So the poem opens with a rhetorical question. Twinning and coiling, of course, the title of the poem indicates that you're talking about a cloud. So you see this image of the clouds coiling, of the clouds stretching. And where is this taking you? Where is this taking the cloud? It's, in this vast space above the stream, surrounding the skies, moving around. This stretching and coiling, according to the translator of this poem, who was Craig Fisk, could be pointing towards beginning or leaving affairs of the secular world. So again, we have this juxtaposition. The cloud is a cloud, but the cloud is also a metaphor for the poet who is a monk, who has abandoned the world, like the cloud is unattached to the physical realm and to ambition and the red dust of the world. Second couplet, you have form, but are not a thing of substance. Leaving no trace, you go off, following the wind. So, after this coiling image, the second couplet continues with the attributes of this cloud, and the way in which it describes them sounds really, really Buddhist. This having form, but not substance, and so being immaterial or empty in a certain way, and just being pushed around by the wind. These are very Buddhist images about impermanence and lack of latching, of attaching, of a concept of the self, which was probably something a Buddhist monk would like to harp on. And finally, the last couplet: don't blame me for always chasing after you, floating about. You're no different than I. So as you can see, the poem is a very good example of the pathetic fallacy, that the poet is dialoguing with this inanimate object, with this cloud, but it's a dialogue with himself, really, because, as I said, the cloud stands in for him. He chases after the cloud because he is like the cloud. He is also unattached to worldly ambitions or desires. He is moving around from place to place, so he is a floating cloud, a wandering cloud himself.